Hand my dad the keys, my husband said, looking at me as if he were asking me to pass the salt at dinner. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. I looked down at the small brass keyring sitting between us on the kitchen table, the same keys I had carried for nearly 35 years. The same keys that opened the front door of the house where I raised our children, celebrated holidays, and built a lifetime of memories. I am Eleanor Whitmore. I was 68 years old when I realized that the man who had promised to stand beside me through every season of life had quietly decided that I no longer belonged in the place I called home. I'm not someone who creates scenes. I never have been. After decades of marriage, I learned that some moments reveal more when you stay silent than when you argue. So I simply looked at Richard and asked, "What exactly are you asking me to do?" He leaned back in his chair and sighed, as if I were making a simple matter complicated. "Eleanor, my dad needs this more than we do. He's getting older. He should have the house. You know that." I glanced toward the window above the kitchen sink. Outside, the maple tree Richard and I planted when we first moved in swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. I remembered standing in that same yard 35 years earlier, holding a cardboard box filled with dishes while Richard carried furniture through the front door. Back then, this house was just four walls and an empty driveway. Together, we turned it into a home. Every room carried a piece of our story. The scratches on the hardwood floor came from our children's first years. The small crack near the fireplace came from the year we renovated the living room ourselves. The garden in the backyard was something I planted one flower at a time. But sitting across from Richard that evening, I realized he was no longer seeing those memories. He was seeing a property, a set of keys, a solution to a problem that I was apparently expected to accept. "Richard," I said quietly, "you're asking me to hand over the home we built." He avoided my eyes for a moment before answering. "It's not about the house. It's about doing what's right." That sentence stayed with me. Doing what's right. I wondered when doing what was right stopped including me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't say the things that were racing through my mind. Instead, I picked up the keys and held them in my palm. They felt heavier than they ever had before. Not because of the metal, but because of everything they represented. Years of work. Years of patience. Years of believing that family meant protecting one another. Richard thought my silence meant I was defeated. He thought the woman sitting across from him was the same woman who always gave in to keep peace. But he had forgotten something important about me. I had spent my entire life preparing for unexpected storms. I had saved documents. I had kept records. I had learned to pay attention, even when people assumed I wasn't watching. So I placed the keys back on the table and gave him a small smile. It was not a smile of agreement. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they finally understand the truth. Richard believed he was taking something from me that night. He didn't realize he had just shown me exactly who he was. And that was the first mistake he made. That evening, after Richard walked away from the kitchen table, I stayed there for a long time without moving. The house was quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I had known for so many years. It felt different. It felt like the walls themselves were waiting for an answer. I ran my fingers across the wooden table where we had shared thousands of meals. There were small marks and scratches on the surface, little reminders of birthdays, holiday dinners, and ordinary nights that somehow became precious memories. For most of my life, I believed a home was built by the people inside it. I never thought there would come a day when I would have to prove that I belonged there. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I had for decades. Old habits stay with you. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and looked out at the backyard. The maple tree stood tall near the fence, its branches moving gently in the morning air. I remembered when Richard and I planted it, together after our youngest child was born. Back then, we were not wealthy. We measured every purchase carefully. We saved for months before replacing old appliances. We painted rooms ourselves because hiring someone was not in our budget. But we were proud because everything we had came from our own effort. That was what made the conversation from the night before so difficult to understand. Richard was not just asking about a house. He was asking me to forget the years that created it. As I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, I started noticing small things I had ignored for months. The way Richard had become quieter whenever money was mentioned. The way he stepped out of the room to answer certain phone calls. The way conversations about family decisions seemed to happen without me. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. After so many years together, I wanted to believe the best about my husband. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. But little moments have a way of collecting over time. A forgotten question. A changed routine. A conversation that suddenly stops when you enter the room. Each one seemed small by itself. Together, they created a picture I could no longer ignore. That afternoon, I found an old photo album while looking for a document in the hallway cabinet. I sat on the floor and slowly turned through the pages. There was Richard and me on the front steps of this house the day we moved in. We looked younger. We looked hopeful. There were pictures of family gatherings, summer afternoons, and Christmas mornings when the living room was filled with wrapping paper and laughter. I stared at those pictures and wondered when we stopped being partners and started becoming people with separate priorities. I did not want to believe Richard had intentionally hurt me, but I also knew something had changed. The woman I saw in those photographs had spent years taking care of everyone else. She had always been the one who remembered appointments, prepared meals, and made sure everyone felt included. She had been the person who quietly held the family together. But now, sitting alone in that hallway, I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider before. Being kind did not mean I had to ignore what was happening around me. Being a wife did not mean I had to disappear. I closed the photo album carefully and placed it back on the shelf. Then I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and began looking through the papers I had collected over the years. I did not know exactly what I would find. I only knew one thing. If Richard had already made decisions about my future, then I needed to understand the truth before anyone else decided it for me. The papers in my desk drawer were not just pieces of paper. They were reminders of a life I had built carefully, one decision at a time. I found old mortgage statements, home improvement receipts, insurance documents, and handwritten notes from years when Richard and I planned our future together. I sat there for almost an hour, reading through everything slowly. The more I looked, the more questions appeared. I noticed that some recent documents were missing. Not lost. Missing. There was a difference. I had always been organized. Richard used to joke that I could find any receipt from any year if I needed it. He would laugh and say, "Eleanor, you keep records like you are running a company." I never thought that habit would one day protect me. Later that afternoon, I decided to call someone I had trusted for many years. Daniel Hayes had handled some of our family legal matters in the past. He was not only our attorney but someone who understood the history behind many of our important decisions. When I called his office, I kept my voice calm. I did not want to sound frightened because I was still trying to understand what was happening myself. "Daniel, I need your help looking over some documents," I said. There was a pause before he answered. "Eleanor, is everything okay?" I looked around my kitchen, the same place where Richard and I had shared morning coffee for decades. "I am not sure," I replied. "And that is exactly why I need to know the truth." The next morning, Daniel came to my house. He carried a folder and placed it gently on the table. Before opening it, he looked at me carefully. "Eleanor, I want you to understand something. Asking questions does not mean you are creating a problem. Sometimes asking questions is how you prevent one." Those words stayed with me. For years, I had avoided conflict because I believed keeping peace was the same as keeping a family together. But maybe there was a difference between peace and silence. Daniel reviewed the documents I had gathered. He asked simple questions. "When did you sign this? Did Richard discuss this with you? Were you aware of this conversation?" Each question made me realize how many decisions had been happening around me instead of with me. Then Daniel opened another document. "Eleanor, there is something you should know." I looked at him and waited. He explained that Richard had recently been asking about changing certain arrangements involving the house. Nothing had been finalized, but conversations were happening. Conversations that I was never invited to join. I felt a familiar heaviness in my chest, but this time it was different. The pain was no longer mixed with confusion. I was beginning to see the situation clearly. Daniel closed the folder and said, "I think you should have a complete picture before you make any decisions." I nodded slowly. For the first time in days, I felt something returning that I thought I had lost. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter. Confidence. That evening, when Richard came home, he acted as if everything was normal. He asked what I had done that day and talked about the weather. I watched him carefully. The man standing in front of me was the same man I had loved for decades, but I was finally seeing the parts of him I had ignored. I answered politely. I prepared dinner. I listened, but inside, something had changed. Richard still believed I was waiting for him to tell me what would happen next. He did not realize I had already started finding my own answers. After Daniel left that evening, I sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea that slowly grew cold in my hands. The house was quiet, but for the first time in many days, I was not overwhelmed by the silence. I was listening to it. There is a difference between feeling abandoned and finally hearing the truth that has been hidden around you. I look at the photographs on the fireplace mantel. There was one from our 25th wedding anniversary. Richard had his arm around me, and we were both smiling like two people who believed we had built something that would last forever. I remembered that day clearly. We had stood in our backyard surrounded by family and friends. Richard had told everyone that I was the person who made our house a home. He said he could not imagine his life without me. Those words stayed with me for years. Maybe that was why accepting what was happening now felt so difficult. It was not just about paperwork or property. It was about realizing that the person who once promised to protect my place in his life was now making decisions without me. The next morning, I started looking through old memories with a different perspective. I opened boxes that had been stored in the closet for years. Inside were cards, letters, and small reminders of our life together. There was a handwritten note from Richard from our first year in the house. He had written that one day we would grow old there together. I held that note for a long time, not because I wanted to hold on to the past, but because I needed to remember that my feelings were real. I had not imagined the life we built. I had not imagined the sacrifices I made. For 35 years, I had been the person who kept everything running. When Richard worked long hours, I handled the home. When our children needed support, I was there. When his parents needed help, I opened our doors without hesitation. I never kept a list of everything I did because I believed family was not a business transaction. You gave because you loved. You helped because that was what people did for one another. But now I wondered if Richard had started seeing my kindness as something he could rely on forever without appreciating it. That afternoon, I received a message from Richard asking if we could talk. He said we needed to finalize things. That phrase stayed in my mind. Finalize things. As if our decades together were a document waiting to be signed. As if my feelings could be organized into a folder and placed away. When he came home, he sat across from me at the dining table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays. The same table where we had helped our children with homework. He spoke carefully, almost rehearsing his words. "Eleanor, I hope you understand why this is necessary. My father needs security." I looked at him and asked, "And what about mine?" He became quiet, just for a moment. It was the first time I saw uncertainty on his face. I did not argue. I did not try to convince him to care. I simply waited, because sometimes the most important answers come from what people choose not to say. And in that moment, I understood something. I had spent years trying to keep my family together, but now I needed to make sure I did not lose myself while doing it. After that conversation with Richard, I realized something had changed between us. It was not a sudden change. It was something that had been building quietly over time, hidden beneath ordinary days and familiar routines. But now that I knew where to look, I started noticing things I had once ignored. The next morning, I received a phone call from Daniel Hayes. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness behind his words. "Eleanor, I reviewed some additional records," he said. "There is something you need to see." I agreed to meet him at his office that afternoon. As I drove there, I looked at the familiar streets outside my window. I had driven those roads for decades. I had taken our children to school on those streets. I had gone grocery shopping, picked up prescriptions, and lived my daily life there. It was strange how a place could feel so familiar, while your own life suddenly felt uncertain. When I arrived, Daniel had several folders arranged neatly on his desk. He always had a way of making complicated things feel manageable. He did not rush me. He simply opened the first folder and began explaining. Eleanor, Richard has been discussing transferring certain interests connected to the property. He has also been speaking with his father about long-term arrangements. I listened carefully. I did not interrupt. Years ago, I might have become emotional hearing those words. I might have asked why Richard would do this after everything we had shared. But something inside me had become calmer. I was no longer trying to understand why someone would disappoint me. I was trying to understand what I needed to do next. Daniel showed me documents that revealed conversations had been happening without my knowledge. Nothing had been completed, but plans were being made. Plans about my home. Plans about my future. Plans that involved everyone except me. I looked down at the papers and thought about all the times I had trusted Richard to consider my feelings because I believed that was what partners did. Why would he think I would simply agree? I asked quietly. Daniel looked at me for a moment before answering. Because sometimes people mistake patience for weakness. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent so many years being patient. I had been patient when Richard forgot important dates. I had been patient when family decisions were made, without asking me. I had been patient because I believed love meant giving people room to make mistakes. But patience did not mean I had no boundaries. When I returned home that evening, Richard was sitting in his favorite chair reading the newspaper. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like someone who believed everything was already decided. "How was your day?" he asked. I placed my purse on the table and smiled gently. "It was productive." He nodded, unaware that I had spent the afternoon learning things he never expected me to know. That night, I walked through each room of the house slowly. I touched the bookshelf where our family albums were kept. I stood near the fireplace where we hung holiday decorations every year. I looked at the dining room table where so many memories had been created. I was not walking through my home as someone afraid of losing it. I was walking through it as someone finally understanding its value. Not just the financial value, the emotional value, the history, the life inside those walls. Richard thought this was a story about a house. He did not realize it was a story about respect. And I had finally reached the point where I was ready to protect both. The days that followed were different. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had changed the way I looked at everything. For years, I had moved through my life trusting that the people closest to me had my best interests at heart. I never questioned every conversation or searched for hidden meanings behind every decision. I believed that was what family was built on. Trust. But now I understood that trust also required awareness. I began quietly organizing everything I had. I gathered old documents, reviewed financial records, and made copies of important papers. I did not do it out of anger. I did it because I finally understood that protecting myself was not the same as creating conflict. Daniel continued helping me understand the information I had found. He explained things clearly and patiently, making sure I knew every detail before making any decisions. "Eleanor," he said during one of our meetings, "the most important thing right now is that you do not make choices because you feel pressured. Take your time. Understand your options." Those words gave me a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to someone else's plans. I was making my own. At home, Richard continued acting as though nothing had changed. He talked about small things. The weather. The neighbors. Plans for the weekend. Ordinary conversations that felt strangely distant now. I answered politely, but I paid attention. I noticed how often he mentioned his father. I noticed how frequently he brought up the idea of simplifying things. I noticed how every suggestion seemed to lead back to the same outcome. A future where decisions were made without me. One evening, Richard sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Eleanor, I hope you have been thinking about what I said," he told me. "My dad really needs this support." I looked at him carefully. "Have you asked me what I need?" He became quiet. It was only for a few seconds, but those seconds told me more than a long explanation could have. Richard had spent so much time thinking about his father's comfort that he had stopped considering mine. I did not argue. I simply stood up and cleared the dishes. That small action surprised him. I think he expected a bigger reaction. He expected tears, frustration, maybe a long conversation where I tried to convince him to change his mind. But I had already learned something important. Sometimes people reveal the most about themselves when you stop trying to change them. A few days later, I received a visit from my daughter-in-law, Megan. She arrived with a smile and a gentle voice, but I could feel that she was there for a reason. She sat in my living room and looked around before speaking. "Eleanor, I know this is difficult," she said, "but maybe it is time to think about what is practical." I looked at her and asked, "Practical for whom?" She paused. For a moment, her expression changed. Then she quickly returned to the same calm tone. "Everyone is just trying to do what is best." I heard those words and remembered all the times I had heard similar phrases throughout my life. Sometimes people use kindness as a way to make you accept something you never agreed to. After she left, I stood by the front window and watched her car disappear down the driveway. I was not filled with anger. I was filled with clarity. Richard and Megan believed they were guiding my future. They believed I would eventually accept their decision. What they did not understand was that I had spent my entire life quietly building strength. I had protected my family for decades. Now it was time to protect myself. The following week, I noticed a change in Richard's behavior. He became more confident, almost as if he believed the outcome had already been decided. He started talking about the future in a way that did not include me. Small comments appeared during ordinary conversations. He mentioned how much easier things would be once certain arrangements were completed. He talked about his father having more space and more comfort. He talked about changes that would make sense for everyone. Everyone except me. I listened quietly. Not because I agreed, but because I had learned that people often reveal their plans when they believe no one is challenging them. For years, Richard had known me as the person who avoided disagreements. The person who would say, "Let's find a way to make everyone happy." The person who would adjust her own needs so others could feel comfortable. He was expecting that same woman to appear again. But the woman sitting at that kitchen table was different. I was still kind. I was still calm. But I was no longer unaware. One Saturday morning, Richard's father, Walter, came to visit. He walked through the house slowly, looking around at the rooms as if he was already imagining them differently. I noticed the way Richard watched him. There was an understanding between them that did not include me. Walter stopped near the living room window and said, "This place has always been a good home." I smiled politely. "Yes, it has." I wanted to add that I knew exactly how much work went into making it that way. The years of cleaning, repairing, decorating, and caring for every corner. But I stayed quiet. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Sometimes timing matters more than emotion. Later that afternoon, I found an old notebook in my office. Inside were notes from when Richard and I first purchased the house. I had written down our goals, our budget, and our plans for the future. We were younger then. We were building something together. Looking through those pages reminded me of a promise I had made to myself many years ago. I promised that no matter what life brought, I would always be responsible for my own choices. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that promise because I was so focused on taking care of everyone else. That evening, Daniel called me with an update. He told me there were additional details he wanted to discuss before I met with Richard again. "Eleanor," he said, "I think you need to be prepared. They may believe you, will simply accept their decision." I looked out the window at the backyard, the place where I had planted flowers every spring, the place where my children had played when they were young, the place where so many memories lived. "Daniel," I said, "I think they have forgotten something important." "What is that?" he asked. I smiled slightly. They forgot that I was there when all of this was built. After I ended the call, I walked through the house one more time. I did not walk through it with fear anymore. I walked through it with appreciation. This home represented more than ownership. It represented my life, my effort, and my history. Richard believed he was waiting for me to surrender. He believed my silence meant I had nothing left to say. But silence was never the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is where a person finds the strength to make their next move. And I was finally ready for mine. The morning after I realized Richard had underestimated me, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the world begins moving. I made my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunlight slowly spread across the backyard. For years, this was my favorite time of day. It was when Richard and I would sit together, talk about our plans, and enjoy the simple comfort of having built a life side by side. But that morning felt different. I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. I was preparing myself. Daniel called me just after 9. His voice was calm, but I could tell he had found something important. "Eleanor, I think you should come by the office today. There are a few things we need to discuss before your next conversation with Richard." I drove to his office with a strange sense of peace. A few weeks earlier, I would have been nervous. I would have wondered if asking questions would create more problems. But now I understood something. Avoiding difficult conversations does not protect a family. Sometimes it only allows problems to grow quietly. When I arrived, Daniel had another folder waiting on his desk. He opened it carefully and placed several documents in front of me. "I want you to look at this," he said. I picked up the papers and began reading. The details were not dramatic. There were no angry messages or obvious signs of conflict. Instead, there were small decisions, small conversations, small steps that showed a plan had been developing without my involvement. That was what hurt the most. Not the paperwork, not the possibility of change. It was realizing that people I trusted had been making choices about my life, while assuming I did not need to know. Daniel looked at me and said, "Eleanor, you've spent many years protecting everyone else's feelings. But you also have the right to protect your own future." I folded the papers neatly and placed them back on the desk. "I do not want to hurt Richard," I said. "I just want him to understand that I am still here." Daniel nodded. "Then the next step is simple. Do not react emotionally. Let the truth speak for itself." Those words stayed with me. Let the truth speak for itself. When I returned home that afternoon, Richard was in the living room. He looked up from his chair and smiled. "Did you have a good day?" he asked. I smiled back. "Yes. Very productive." He did not notice the difference in my voice. He did not notice that I was no longer searching for answers from him. I had started finding them myself. That evening, I prepared dinner as usual. I set the table. I placed the plates exactly where they had always been. From the outside, everything looked normal. But inside, I felt a quiet strength returning. Richard believed he was guiding me toward a future he had already planned. He believed I would eventually accept whatever decision he made. What he did not understand was that I was no longer the woman who waited for permission to speak. I was the woman who had spent decades building this home, caring for this family, and carrying responsibilities that others never saw. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I kept old family photographs. I looked at the pictures one by one. There was Richard holding our children when they were young. There was our first Christmas in this house. There were birthdays, vacations, and ordinary moments that meant everything. I did not look at those memories with sadness anymore. I looked at them as proof. Proof that my place in this family was not something someone could simply erase. The next conversation with Richard would be different. I would not enter it as someone begging to be heard. I would enter it as someone who already knew her worth. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to let everyone else see it too.